This is Chapter 8, Thinking, Language, and Intelligence, Part 2. So now we'll take a look at language. The building blocks of language. It'll include things like a phenom. And a phenom you know as the smallest basic unit of speech or a sound. In the English language, it's basically there's about 40 phenoms. A morpheme, that's the smallest meaningful unit that's within language, and it's formed with a combination of phenoms. Now, grammar rules that'll specify how the phenoms and the morphemes and words as well as phrases, how it all should be combined to be able to express meaningful thoughts. These rules will include the syntax as well as semantics. So what motivates children to develop language anyway? Now we're coming back to that nature versus nurture debate here, and it has a different set of supporters. However, most psychologists would believe that language acquisition would be a combination of both biology, which is the nature, and environmental, which is nurture. Can you see how both might contribute to this child's pretend phone conversation? Think about when you was a child. We all had an imaginary friend that we would talk to and speak to, or we would play, we would have those little toy phones, and we'd be just conversating all day long like there was somebody truly on the other line. Well, that's what we're speaking about here in terms of language. How to talk to kids. Now, hopefully I'll be able to generate a video for you, but some kids are going to be better than others at being able to understand complex language. Scientists have thought that this was an inborn ability, but it's actually been seen and demonstrated that the way we speak to children really have a huge effect. So the term motherese is a term that's given to adults who taught baby language to children, which really that should be a no-no. In order to help a child develop their language skills, we need to speak to them as if we're speaking to adults, giving them the correct forms of words, using those morphemes and phemes, using nouns correctly, helping them to create the syntax as well as the semantics. Now, with language acquisition, about 750,000 Americans actually suffer from stroke each year. And we have to think about how our brain bounces back. In many cases, their ability to be able to understand and use language, it actually becomes severely impaired. So studies have been able to show and demonstrate how this ability is not lost for good. Within this slide here, it kind of gives you basically a breakdown of each of the different stages, that being pre-linguistic stage during infancy. The baby's form of communication comes through crying and being able to coo as well as babbling, okay? And believe it or not, we're able to understand. Think about if you have children, you'll understand already. But if you don't have children yet, when a baby cries, for example, the mother's going to automatically go to check to see if the baby's hungry. They're going to check to see if the baby needs to be changed or if the baby's comfortable. Get the picture. So the baby learns how to start to communicate by using crying because they'll know that their mother will respond. When a child gets from 12 months to 2 years, now the babbling starts to really start to become a language in the sense that they'll start to be able to string 1 or 2 words together. They're taught mommy and daddy, and I tell my other classes about this in essence of my mistake was I did use motherese when I was a youngster, and instead of teaching my sons to say daddy, I taught them dada. Now here's the thing. They're all grown and they're all in their 30s and they still say dada. They say it doesn't feel right to say dad, pop, or daddy. They said it, Dada just feels better. So now you understand the importance why we shouldn't use motherese. I was guilty of using it when I was younger. But also realize that speech is going to usually be with one word utterances. So when a baby's hungry or they might see something like cookie, they're not going to ask for a cookie and say, may I have a cookie, please? They'll say cookie, cookie, or gimme, the two words, gimme, gimme. So anyway, I think you're getting a picture of that. Moving on, let's talk about 2 years to 5 years old. Here it's going to be more of that telegraphic type speech. Here they'll drop the non-essential words so much, like verbs and adjectives. Again, using gimme or me want the cookie, or mommy goes bye-bye, or take me here. So they'll have their what I call the fast phrase of speech. You know how we do short-term writing, short writing, handwriting. We will throw out the verbs, and just leave nouns. Similar situation. However, know that during this time period, the vocabulary increases vastly. It's like over the world. But there is a lot of overgeneralization of many of the words that children will use. They'll apply the basic rules of grammar, but in the cases they might say, well, I go to the zoo. Instead of saying I want to go to the zoo, I goed. So they'll change it up because they're not quite sure of how to speak correctly all the way yet. It's a learning process, just like with everything else. All right, so in terms of animals and language, we know that a lot of studies have been done with apes, and they've been able to use sign language and be able to actually type. Some have been taught to type on the computers, on keyboards. And we also know that dolphins, they understand hand signals as well as audible commands. So researchers, again, they've been able to discover that some monkeys, they are able to process those sounds, whereas other monkeys, their brains are much like the way people would process language. As this, uh, has been discovered, it's also shown that it leads to a better way of understanding how people acquire our ability to communicate. So there's one of the big reasons why we'll study animals, because particularly with primates, they help and demonstrate because a lot of their learning patterns are actually similar to our own. Now let's get into intelligence. So in the 1920s, there was a British psychologist named Charles Spearman, and he is the first person who observed high scores that was on separate tests of mental abilities and how they kind of correlate with one another. Now, Spearman, back in 1923, proposed that intelligence really is a single factor, which he kind of called it general intelligence. And what we put it as within our formula is just G, the letter G. Now, he believed that G underlies all intellectual behavior, that being with reasoning, our ability to problem solve, performing well in all areas of thinking and cognition. Spearman's work laid the foundation for how we utilize and standardize intelligence tests. Now, Raymond Cattell, let me bring that up because I'm busy talking and not giving you the slideshow, but Raymond Cattell, he came up with two subtypes of a G that would exist. One being fluent intelligence, which you can call as well as GF. And this is referring to our innate and inherited reasoning abilities, our memory, as well as how the information of it is, how speedy it is within information processing. Fluent intelligence relatively is going to be independent of our education as well as experience, and like other biological capacity, it doesn't really decline with age. Okay. Now, crystallized intelligence well, it actually do decline. The fluid, it's fast, it's going, it's moving, it works straight through short term, and sometimes we get it into long term, but not as much. However, crystallized intelligence, which is GC, now this is referring to how we store the knowledge and the skills that we get through experiences and education. Now, crystallized intelligence, this increases over the lifespan, and we tend to keep the crystallized information. Now, there's many forms of intelligence, and one theorist, Gardner, he came up with the theory about multiple intelligence. And what he believed was that people have many kinds of intelligence. The fact that that brain damaged patients, they often lose some of their intellectual abilities while retaining others, suggests that Gardner suggested to Gardner that there was different intelligence located in discrete areas throughout our brains. So according to Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence, people have different profiles of intelligence because they're stronger in some areas and weaker in others. But they also use their intelligence differently to be able to learn new material, to be able to perform different tasks and solve problems. So in his theory, he looks at linguistic as being language on our ability to speak, our ability to read, as well as write and story. And what he did was take a look at, well, what type of careers might that person go into? Um, that's how we utilize it today. So someone strong in linguistics, they might be a novelist. They might want to write, be a writer. They might be a teacher. Those who are strong in spatial areas tend to be architects, engineers, pilots, scientists. Those with bodily or kinesthetic that's fluid and able to move good and have rhythm, they tend to be more of the athletic type, or they may be dancers. The interpersonals, these individuals that are strong in this area, they kind of know themselves pretty well as they're able to set goals for themselves and be able to keep those goals. And they also recognize when they might be beating themselves up. So they can take on almost any type of career and do well. Then those who are strong in the logical or mathematical areas, of course, scientists again, engineers, mathematicians, musical strengths, those are our singers, like Aretha Franklin, um, oh Lord, Mary J. Blige, and I know I'm going back, I'm seasoned, forgive me. But think of those in your era. Uh, they are probably strong within the musical realm. And interpersonal, the first one was intrapersonal, this one's interpersonal. Now, people, I would put myself in this category of having strong suit here as I'm a psychologist. And those in this that's strong in these areas, they're usually good with sales. They're good with management. They're good as therapists as well as teachers. Individuals that demonstrated strengths in naturalistics are more of those who would be in neuroscience and doing biology, as well as a naturalist. And then you have strength in existential or spiritual. Here you might have theologians or philosophers because that's where their strength lies. So according to Robert Sternberg's model, and it's the Triarchic theory, there are three separate and different aspects to intelligence. Now, each of these components is learned. It's not because of our genetics, okay? So with that, each can be strengthened or it can be improved. And what he's kind of talked about was analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, as well as practical intelligence. And those type of skills that mean with the analytical, our abilities to think so strong, we're able to evaluate, have good judgment and insight, we're able to do good comparative and conceptualizations. Creative intelligence, now this is where innovation comes into play and you allow your imagination to create. Think of artists as well as novelists because they come up with stories of like science fiction and so. Practical, those are hands-on. That's where their strength lies, and they're great with application and being able to execute and implement new things. So Daniel Goleman's research looks into emotional intelligence. And he has several best-selling books that's been popularized by the concept of EI. Think about the original work that was by Peter Salovey as well as John Mayer. Now, popular accounts such as Goldman's would have suggested that the traditional measures of human intelligence kind of ignores a crucial range of abilities that characterize people who basically excel in real life: self-awareness, their impulse control, persistence, zeal, as well as being able to be self-motivated, empathetic, and have social deftness. Goldman also proposed that many societal problems like domestic abuse and youth violence can really be attributed to a low emotional intelligence. So he argued that emotional intelligence has to be fostered in everyone in order for you to be content with life. So just remember the definitions here that they're given, that emotional intelligence do involve the ability to know and manage one's emotions, being empathetic with others, as well as keeping a good and healthy relationship. Now we're going to start talking about Stanford-Binet and measuring how we measure intelligence. So talking about measuring intelligence, this is the distribution of scores that Stanford-Binet intelligence test has come up with and created. 68% of children scored within one standard deviation, and a standard deviation here is relative to 16 points. That would be either above or below what the national average would be, and that average would be of 100 points. So about 16% would score above, which is 116, and then 16% below, which would make that 84. So the Stanford-Binet intelligence scale is loosely based on what the first IQ test developed in France was about, and it turned of the last century by Binet. And here in the U.S., Lewis Terman, back in 1916, developed the Stanford-Binet, and this was done at Stanford University, hence the Stanford-Binet, and the ability to be able to test intellectual ability of U.S.-born children from ages 3 to 16. Now, the test has gone through many different revisions, and most recently, the test has been revised. I believe it was about 2014. So, that test has been administered individually as well as it's done with a lot of tasks of being able to copy geometric designs, looking at identifying similarities, being able to show repeating number sequences. Okay, so the intelligence quotient basically is going to be able to be expressed within this curve that you're seeing here on the slide. Now, the more popular brand, I would say, Stanford-Binet is highly used, but I think one of the more popular intelligence tests comes from Wechsler. Okay, now with Wechsler's test measuring of intelligence, it yields a final intelligence score. But basically, they have separated the verbal, which would be vocabulary, comprehension, knowledge of general information, as well as from the performance scores. Those arranging pictures to tell a story, or like arranging blocks to be able to match a given pattern. There's been different abilities that can be evaluated that's either separate or together. And people who are unable to speak or understand English can still be tested. Now, the verbal portion of this test doesn't have to be administered because each subtest actually yields its own score. And some of the things that it looks at would be information, comprehension, arithmetic, similarities, digit span. And digit spans, what they have is they'll have you repeat a set of numbers and make you go backwards with it, as well as vocabulary. And this is another test that has gone through a whole lot of different revisions. I believe they're actually up to the WAIS, which is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It's just saying Wechsler here, but WAIS actually stands for Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and I believe they're up to number 5. So, other areas that is looked at is digit symbol, picture completion, where they'll have a person actually look at for alertness within their visual memory through presenting incomplete type figures and then having a person try to figure out what should be there. Block design, being able to fit things correctly, as well as picture arrangements. They'll show a series of pictures and then you have to tell the story and try to put it in the correct order. And then, of course, object assembly. So, what makes a good test anyway? Pretty much is what we call standardization. These are intelligence tests as well as a personality or aptitude, and most tests that we use must be standardized in 2 ways, okay? The first would be that the test must have norms or average scores that's developed by giving a test to a representative body or a sample of people. This would be a diverse group of people who resemble those of whom the test was intended for. The second thing would be being able to test procedures that must be standardized. All test takers must be given the same instructions, the same questions, the same time limits, as well as all test administrators. They have to follow the same objective score of the standards. Okay. Then we have reliability. With reliability, it's retesting that can be done via the test-retest method, in which participants is going to pretty much score on 2 separate administrations of the same test, and then it's compared, or it'll be a split half method that can be used, which would involve splitting the test within 2 equivalent parts, that being an odd and even questions, and then determine whether the degree of the similarity between the 2 halves, whether it shows any credibility, so to speak, which then, if it does, it allows us to look at validity. And this is really the most important type of validity. It's important for us to have that, to be able to measure what was designed and make sure it's measuring what we want it to measure. So the most pertinent or important part would be what we call criterion-related validity, or basically the accuracy which test scores can be used to be able to predict another variable of interest, this being known as the criterion. So criterion-related validity will be expressed as the correlation between the test score and the criterion. So if 2 variables are highly correlated, then one variable can be used to predict the other. Thus, if a test is valid, its scores will be useful in allowing us to predict people's behavior in some things, in some situations. One example we can think of is using intelligence scores to be able to predict your grades in school. Okay, so you can see why a test that's standardized and reliable but not valid would actually be worthless. Okay. Another example to think about is a test for like skin sensitivity. Maybe it can be easy to standardize, that being that the instructions would specify exactly how to apply the test agent. And then it might be reliable. Similar results can be obtained on each retest, but it certainly wouldn't be valid for predicting your grades in college, right? So that's how you can see the connection to the 3. It must be, the good test has to be standardized, It must be reliable, and then we have to make sure it's valid. It's going to measure what we intended it for it to measure. Now, of course, there's a controversy in a lot of different things, and of course, with intelligence, that still rings true. So, we're looking at mental challenges, okay? Some extremes in terms of intelligence. Fewer than 3% of people would be classified as having intellectual challenges. And of this group, 85% have only mild challenges, intellectual challenge, and many might become self-supported and integrated members of society. Another thing you have to consider is that people can score low on some measures of intelligence and still be average or even gifted in other areas. The most dramatic type of examples are people with savant type syndrome. And the savant syndrome is one of those conditions in which a person with limited mental abilities really still exhibit exceptional skills or brilliance in some type of limited field or area. Now, mental giftedness, and we all would like to be mentally gifted. I know I do. But these individuals who are considered gifted, they always have great grades. Their sociability levels are high. They like to connect with others. Um, Actually, physically speaking, they appear taller as well as stronger. They're more likely to be successful. You'll find them in professional fields such as psychology and working in academia, people of entrepreneurs. And just like the natural average, they do have high rates of divorce, suicide, as well as struggling with substance issues like alcohol. So, who is gifted? People who usually are considered to have very high IQs are usually in the top 1 or 2% of intelligence scales. And I think at this point I'm going to stop right here and we'll pick up again in the next video.